Welcome back to Westeros.org's YouTube videos. It's been a while since we did one of these, since last season, as usual. We had said we'd be back with the book-focused videos a little earlier, but, you know, time kind of flew, as usual.
Yeah,
as usual again. And we decided that now it was a good time because we have there's a new book out, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, collecting the stories of Duncan Egg, previously out in various anthologies. So we thought we'd talk a little bit about what these stories, this anthology and these stories. And so there will be an introduction today about the story collection in general. We'll cover the first story, the Hedge Knight, and then hopefully we'll be doing 2 follow-ups to deal with the other 2 stories.
Maybe 3 follow-ups, but yeah.
Yeah.
So what are the Duncan Egg stories? These are currently 3 novellas, but part of a planned cycle of novellas covering the titular characters, Sir Duncan the Tall, and his squire Egg. These stories, the first of them was George started writing it, I think, in about 97. It was published in 97 actually, so he might have been, it was right after Game of Thrones had come out. He was working on A Clash of Kings, and Robert Silverberg, the very grand master of science fiction, contacted George, among other authors, and said, he wanted him to contribute a story to his anthology he was doing called Legends, which was some of these short works from, masters of fantasy, which is very interesting, of course, that he tagged George. George had just the one book out and didn't do that well in hardcover. It really started gaining ground in paperback. But, of course, Silverberg knew George's writing from when he was more regularly a writer of science fiction,
especially as a short story and novella writer.
Especially as a short story writer, he was one of the best writers when he was really actively writing, working in the genre. So he invited him, and so this led to George deciding, what am I going to write? I mean, the idea was you're supposed to write a short work in your main fantasy setting, right?
So you had the headline of the book was Robert Jordan was among them with a Wheel of Time story.
Yeah, Stephen King had the Dark Tower story. And McCaffrey had a Pern
exploring
story.
Things in the past, usually of your big setting, and I guess this led George to starting to think more about the past of Westeros.
Exactly.
And there were a lot of things at this point that were not established, and there were a lot of things that, as we see when we look at the first Duncan Egg story compared to the later, there were details that grew out only later there.
For sure.
So the history was very much more nebulous than as we know it today, especially after The World of Ice and Fire.
So these stories take place about 90 years prior to the present time. I mean, the first story is in the year 208, in the reign of King Daeron the Good. And obviously George was starting to think, okay, well, he had already written his sort of line of kings in the back of Game of Thrones. And he had little notes, little ideas. So, he knew that Daeron was Daeron the Good. He knew that
the last dragons had died.
Yes.
I wonder how much that played actually into, I realize now, that he wanted a period quite soon after the death of, it's some 30, 40 years, right? Or how old is Arlen?
Well, the last dragon died. Arlen is in his 60s, and he claims to have seen the last dragon. He was very young when he saw it.
He was very young. So it's in the period, there are no more dragons, but there are still some people who remember them.
Yeah, and it's not that far off, but I think, and so he introduces all these characters, all these descendants of Daeron, all these Targaryens, and most notably he creates Duncan the Tall. The thing is if you look at this story and you compare it to the later stories, I mean, the main element that changes, like suddenly it appears out of nowhere, is the Blackfire Rebellion. It is nowhere in sight when he wrote the story. I think it's pretty clear that George, in 1997, had not yet come up with this whole concept. I think related concept, real ideas connected to the whole Song of Ice and Fire were there, I think. But the specifics of a Targaryen bastard leading to generations of strife wasn't there.
We know, of course, for our own part, that when we got those old notes that we have mentioned before from George, that was in 98, 99, I think. So And those have the seed of the Blackfires, which obviously starts with Aegon the Unworthy and his legitimizing all his bastards, including Daemon Blackfire, and giving him the Blackfire sword. So there, sometime after the Hedge Knight, maybe while working on a Clash of Kings, although there's no hint.
Well, no. He was done with.
He was done with the Clash of Kings. Yeah. So it's after a Clash of Kings that he goes back and not only decides that this is going to be more books. Well, he's already decided that it's not a trilogy.
Yeah.
But it's going to be even more than that, and there needs to be more history. At some point there, he fleshes out some of the kings. We know from conversations we had for The World of Ice and Fire, for the kings that he didn't end up writing fully for the book, the later Targaryens, that he has a lot of notes for the period that Dunk and Egg, the future stories, are going to play out. But all of this comes after the first two novels and the first novella.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, it's in the first novel it really features the Blackfire stuff, is, of course, A Storm of Swords. Whereas when it's first mentioned by Catelyn about the Blackfires who troubled the realm for 5 generations and so on. And obviously, for those who follow the novels currently, there's a lot of talk about Blackfires. Are certain people Blackfires? Are they connected to Blackfires? That was not part, in that form, of the original conception of the story. There is one aspect that I think, we'll discuss when we discuss the Sworn Sword, or maybe the Mystery Knight, actually. But otherwise, it was really, it's a tale of a Gruen telling, and it shows how fluid the story was. I recall from the notes, I was looking at the notes. We still have them, and there are changes. Things changed along the way. One of the things that changed, that I always thought remarkable, was, when he wrote these notes, he started thinking, well, I'll put this Daemon Blackfire battle in the Red Grass Field in the year 204. It was about 4 years prior to, the Hedge Knight. And I think then he must have realized, well, that makes no sense that there's no reference to it so close. So he then obviously changes it and puts it a bit further back in time. And that leads to the whole idea that a young orphan from Flea Bottom is taken up by this knight whose squire has been killed.
Yeah.
And it's just really fascinating that you can see the bones of things and Aerion things. If you want to talk about the role of Blackfires or not in the story, you consider that mysterious conversation between Varys and Illyrio beneath the Red Keep, and the way the plans have formed. George has been playing it by ear. But I think it's really interesting. A lot of writers, when you look at the process, when you look at the creative process of a writer, like Tolkien is one of the writers, the fantasy writers that we have the most about the creative process because of the histories of Middle Earth.
People like to think that he kind of sprang fully formed from his mind, and then you look at all the different versions and that Christopher Tolkien has been painstakingly putting together and trying to sort of trace with Tolkien there's so much material that you can do actual study of the text and see how it has been evolving, because there are all these versions available and you can actually go and see how it's been changing over time for some of the passages that he worked a lot on.
Yeah.
So even with such a detailed, prolific world builder, it changes over time when you're looking at backstory. And I think that if George hadn't started writing the Dunk and Egg novellas, he might have, done something completely different and still worked out because now every time he decides something in the past, he locks himself in. Yes. And that's always been, we kind of learned that in the process working on The World of Ice and Fire, that George likes having a lot of room to play with the stories. So when he locks himself in as a detail rather than something as in a story, he always finds that a little limiting in a sense. But, he's written these 3 novellas now, and he has plans for maybe as many as 12 in total. Although he's now clearly said it won't happen until after Song of Ice and Fire is finished. But these 3 first were all published in different anthologies. Yeah,
Legends was the first one. Legends 2.
And then
for the Sworn Sword, and then
Warriors, right?
Warriors,
the anthology that George and
Gardner Dozois
edited
together. Yeah. So
they've been hard to get a hold of. because of that, split up over different anthologies. Those anthologies have been published and, split up into paperbacks. You've had Legends 1 split up into Legends 1, 2, 3, which made it really confusing when you were talking about Legends 1 and Legends 2, because there were suddenly 2 Legends 2. Yeah. I think the ebooks may have made it a little easier, but still, they've been hard to find. So they wanted to publish a collected edition of the 3 that were available so far. It was actually out in several countries before the English edition.
Including Sweden, actually.
Including Sweden. They didn't have them translated before, so they went ahead. The reason that the American and British editions have only come out now is the fact that they decided they wanted them illustrated. And when they approached Gary Gianni, who's done like Prince Valiant art, among other things, he didn't just want to do a few illustrations. He wanted to illustrate the whole thing in the style of the old Howard Pyle Arthurian novels and Robin Hoods, and which I absolutely adore myself, having these big pieces with the text and that style of it. And this is exactly what we've got in this edition. The art is absolutely gorgeous. It's really old style, and it really captures the characters.
I really do. I mean, obviously there's I find like his depiction of how huge Dunk is, how little Egg is, kind of, it's endearing. It's a little bit of a character, and Egg's head is always just a little bit egg-like and a little bit oversized for his body, but it really gives a lot of humor.
Gorgeous bits of knights and jousting and armor and
it is
and medieval clothing, proper medieval clothing all over.
Everyone.
Some of it too proper for A Song of Ice and Fire, because there are a lot of hats and headgear in there.
Yes, George tends to forget about the hats.
Yes,
like you didn't go out
bareheaded. No,
like in general. So
he's got his. I think Aerion Bright Flame is wearing one of those fancy little cap things with a lyre pipe, I think, or something like that. I
don't think it was a lyre pipe, but
maybe,
it was a bit one of those big
flashy things, and there's all sorts of headgear going on.
No, but they're great illustrations for those who've read the stories before. Now, why should I bother? It just looks really beautiful with these illustrations. It adds, like when we saw it, we got to see it early. I just mailed Anne Grovey, George's editor, just wow. It was just jaw dropping. I would love to own some of those pieces.
Yeah, I'd like to see them in big size, actually, some of them.
Yeah. I was thinking some of them, I would love to have like a Duncan Egg, like one of a depiction of Duncan Egg writing together, like on a t-shirt or something.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, that said, so A Knight of Seven Kingdoms out now, in the US, the UK. I think some of the other countries are going to come out with the illustrated editions as well. If you can get a hold of it, it's absolutely worth your time, because it deepens the lore, the background. I mean, and this first story itself, I mean, just the introduction, it's a beautiful gem of a story. I mean, it was a World Fantasy Award nominee, and that was quite noteworthy. I recall one of the SF sites back then, you used to have these IRC chats, and George and Gardner were there discussing the World Fantasy Award, like the fact that he was nominated, and George seemed it was just very funny, kind of discussing like the other nominated works, and one of the works was actually kind of more of an alternate history, and he was a little scratching his head, like why is an alternate history in the World Fantasy Award? But he, I think it's the one that actually won as well, so to his chagrin maybe. But it is a great story, and we'll actually go on to actually discuss specifically about Hedge Knight, and some of the things that you discover therein. So Hedge Knight introduces us to Sir Duncan the Tall, Dunk. In fact, Duncan is probably...
He doesn't know.
He doesn't really know.
Somebody asks him if it's short for Duncan, basically, in the story, and he kind of, well, maybe is, but he figured it sounds better anyway. Yeah,
it definitely sounds better than Sir Dunk.
Yes.
He was an orphan in Fleece Bottom, a Kingslander, who later on he ends up becoming squire to Sir Arnold Pennytree. We'll learn more about the whys and wherefores in the second story. But he's followed this old Hedge Knight, and a Hedge Knight is... George uses this idea as a concept that existed in the Middle Ages, is the idea of someone who is sleeping under hedges because they are landless, they are lordless, they wander around the countryside looking for employment. There were, hedge witches and hedge doctors, but there are hedge knights in the setting, and Sir Arlen and Dunk go around traveling to seeking employment. And Sir Arlen kind of teaches him sort of the basics of chivalry and knighthood and some very, very, very basic training in sort of arms and things. Arlen's a bit old and doesn't really have their life is too hard, too much scraping after to spend much time. Despite this, Dunk really wants to be a knight. And, when he buries Sir Arlen, Sir Elio was on his way to Ashford for Tourney, and he thinks, he's been knighted, and he's like, but can I really prove that I'm a knight? I was a squire. Maybe I should go and join a city watch somewhere. Maybe I should squire for someone else, or maybe I should take the chance of going to Ashford and writing him a tourney which has the rules that only knights can participate. We'll talk more about tourneys in general in a bit, but of course, the big thing is, and many readers pick up on it, but some don't, is the whole question, is Dunk really a knight? And I think it's fairly clear that he is not.
I mean, it starts with the passage that you talk about there, where he sort of makes the decision to portray himself as a knight. And that one's kind of very ambiguous. And then you have him when he's approaching to enlist. And the guy asks him, this is a tourney for knights. Are you a knight? And he says yes. And he thinks to himself, he hopes his ears aren't red. Yeah. So there's all these little bits. And some of it could just be that he's kind of awkward about being questioned. He has no way of proving it. He hesitates when the time comes for his friend Raymond, who needs to be knighted to take part in the trial of 7 that Dunk has fallen into. He doesn't want to do the knighting, but that, it could just be that he feels it's not appropriate. He's a hedge knight.
Well, yes, or he doesn't want to risk his friend's life and try fighting for him.
So you can explain away a lot of them, but there's one that is conclusive, really. And
even there, I won't go that far.
Well,
but I love it.
It's very strong, and George kind of slips it in to a situation because it's right in the middle of the trial of 7, and there's so much else going on.
Yeah, where he thinks himself after Aerion hits him, he broke my head and I'm dying, and what was worse was the others who had died with him, Raymond and Prince Baelor and the rest. I failed them. I am no champion. I'm not even a hedge knight. I am nothing. Obviously, again, you can read as it's like I'm worthless. I'm not. I shouldn't be called this because I'm no good at it. But
all of the things taken together. Of course, there's the other one where he is talking to Egg early on, and Egg is portraying himself. He has found out who Egg really is. He's not some random orphan. He is, in fact, Prince Aegon, who was supposed to squire for his brother Daeron, but Daeron, called the Drunken, is not really keen on the whole tourney thing, and has run off with Egg. He decided to, shave his head to hide the Targaryen hair. Daeron himself, they're half Dornish, so he...
Well, his father's
half Dornish, yeah, so he doesn't have the look. He's got brown hair, but he has to hide Egg. And then Egg, takes up with Duncan and lies to him. And then, Duncan is thinking about, I know how it is to want something so much that you're willing to tell a monstrous lie. And what are the monstrous lies Duncan is supposed to have been told?
That was probably the best one, because you have to assume that either you just have to imagine, there's some hint of some past lie, or it's literally like he's lied about this because he dreams of being a knight. And of course, the big point of the story is ultimately, what's knighthood? What's chivalry? What's being honorable? George often comes back to the idea.
What's a true knight, and what's a knight who remembers his vows?
Yes, I mean the bit where I get a little. This makes me a little like when he comes out, and it's the day of the trial of 7, and all these people are coming to him, and there's a poor brother who gives him a blessing, and there's people who thank him and wish him luck, and he asks he doesn't understand, what are they doing? What am I to them? And a knight who remembers his vows, as Steely Pate said, and I think this is love. It's a lovely sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that he isn't a knight by the rules of the 7 Kingdoms,
but in heart and spirit,
he is. He's one of the truest knights around there, and he's like, he's got the whole chivalry thing, you know, like Sansa, who's enamored with it and believes in it, and or like Brienne, even more so obviously, who really wants to be a knight and believe in the knightly ideals, even though, you know, she can't be one.
Because she's a woman, yes.
Yeah.
And I'm very apropos because obviously it was...
Yeah.
I think at the end we'll discuss Brienne, I think, at the end of the series of videos, because she can tie back to this whole thing. There's a fantastic story, and I just love kind of every element of it, and the way George kind of depicts Dunk as sort of this young, idealistic guy, and kind of awkward that he's really tall, and everyone was...
And he's not a great fighter.
He's not at all.
It's realistic in the sense that he's only had a very little training, and yes, he is big and strong, so he does have some advantages in that. When, you know, the thing that decides it in the fight is that, yes, like, you know, Aerion can defeat Sir Duncan the Tall, but he can't defeat Dunk of Fleabottom, who decides to fight dirty and made it get into a wrestling match about strength like that. Then, you know, so he kind of has to recognize his roots there. But I reread the story when sort of in preparation for the collection coming out, and it had been quite a while since I read it, and it really is, you know, it has definitely that bittersweet vibe that George is so good at creating, because, you know, even if Dunk manages in the end, you know, it's at a great cost, and he kind of has to live with, was it worth it? You know, was it worth saving a Hedge Knight's hand and foot over having, you know, Prince Baelor Breakspear, the great knight of his age, die in a tourney mishap, and his brother ending up being blamed for it afterwards, and, you know, Prince Maekar himself questions Dunk about it, and that scene where Dunk basically, well, you know, maybe there'll come a day when the realm has need of a, you know, a Hedge Knight's hand or foot, or however he puts it. But.
So it did. But again, you know, for those, obviously in the novels, we start with Storm of Swords, we get the reference of the great Lord Commanders of the past, including Lord Commander Sir Duncan the Tall, who Jamie obviously considers one of the sort of heroes of the Kingsguard, the worthies who you know, merit respect and admiration for being great knights.
So we know now sort of one of the end points of the story is, or the sort of Dunk and Egg story
one
together.
One
of the destinations, but we really don't know quite how they're getting there. I think that obviously this is going to be a discussion more for the second novella, The Sworn Sword, but people were expecting very different things when they heard that title, for example, The Sworn Sword. Then actually the story ended up containing. So I think that George is going to, if he gets around to doing all of these stories, they're going to take some interesting turns, and they're going to be exploring facets of knighthood, of life in the Seven Kingdoms, as, you know, he can't necessarily do in A Song of Ice and Fire in the same way.
Let's discuss. We're going to move on to the setting of the story, which is a tourney, which is a rather unusual tourney in some respects.
Yes.
So the Ashford tourney, thrown by Lord Ashford in honor of his, you know, maiden daughter's name day, is you know,
enormous.
Ashford, it's enormous, and it's an enormous affair for what is a fairly middling lord of a middling town in the Reach, and yet it attracts to it. I mean, the list of people present is huge. Partly we know how many are present, how many significant people are present, because George, for the comic book adaptation of the Hedge Knight by the Dabble Brothers, which is a very fine adaptation, I thought, with Ben Avery did the script, very faithful to the story. Mike S. Miller did the art, some really great pieces from him. But one of the things he did for the graphic novel, the collection of the 6 issues, was George provided a rule of arms. And this rule of arms listed every notable knight who was, I wouldn't say just present, but certainly, for the most part, it's the people who actually participated, but some other people are just present. Like, Prince Baelor was not intending to ride in a tourney, and He even included Raymond Fossaway, despite that he was at the Trial of Seven. He didn't take part in that. But so I counted up the total people who actually participated in the actual jousting, and there were 66 knights listed as participants. Whereas when you look at the tourney in King's Landing, for the tower, the tourney of a hand, in which Robert has given a really extravagant, absolutely enormous prizes. I mean, ridiculous prizes. And it's the capital. It's the most prestigious tourney in ages, one supposes, and it attracts maybe 64 people because we know Loras Tyrrell has 4 jousts on the first day, and then on the second day, it's the last couple of jousts. It's, to determine the finalists from the 4 people left. So that would be 6 jousts. That's 64. So already this is really big. And it's not just really big, but in terms of number of participants. It's really big in terms of who was participating. So you've got, of course, the royal princes, including the crown prince, the greatest knight of his age, Baelor Brigspear, and his heir, and, his brother and his sons. And of course, obviously there's the Knights of Kingsguard with them. Then there's the Lords Tyrrell and Lannister and Tully. 2 significant martial lords, Lord Swan and Lord Karen. The heir to Storm's End, another famous knight. Yeah. I forgot also, of course, Lord Lannister has his heir with him. And besides that, you have the heirs, and this is from the Roll of Arms, the heirs to Hightower, Blackhaven, Greenstone, Hornhill, Cider Hall, Brightwater Keep, and Raventree Hall. Oh, and besides that, Offal Bracken was in line to become heir to Stonehenge, the Bracken lands. So it's ridiculous. The only explanation I can give for it is Baelor indicated that he wanted to do a progress into the Reach to visit, and everyone kind of flocked to be in his orbit. And
everyone except any Dornish knights.
That's the one interesting bit. There are no Dornishmen. Not at all in this Roll of Arms. The only Dornishmen present are that we're told of are the puppeteers. Tansley, Tutol, I think it was her uncle, right, was the fellow running it, I believe.
Yeah.
They're the only Dornishmen there, which is kind of interesting because
they're part of the realm now.
It's part of the realm. We know that Baelor is half Dornish. You would think Dornishmen would want just as much want to hang out with this great prince and sort of the heir to the realm, the Prince of Dragonstone, and yet they're not present. And I think at this nascent point in time, this may be the first suggestion that George had this idea that yes, the realm was brought together by Daeron, but it's not like everyone liked it. He didn't have, when he was writing the story, he didn't have the Blackfire Rebellion. He didn't have Eustace Osprey saying it's, because the court was full of Dornishmen. So he doesn't really have...
Because if the court was full of Dornishmen, you'd think some of them would have been there.
So to me, it feels like George has a notion, but he hasn't really worked out the mechanics of it and so on. So I think if you look at it, the explanation has to be that he doesn't imagine tensions are such that even though Baelor is half Dornish, relations between the Reach and Dorne are such poor enough that Dornishmen really wouldn't want to be there under normal circumstances.
Certainly I guess he might have hinted at it in the sense that, well, the puppeteers are there, but, when the puppeteers they get attacked by Prince Aerion, but you kind of get the sense that he thinks it's a sort of perfectly fine thing to do because they are Dornish.
Yeah.
So there's no real, outrage over it. Then again, people support Duncan because he takes their side, so it's difficult to see how... certainly, Aerion seems to think that, these Dornish are still plotting to overthrow the Targaryens, so...
Yeah, one of my favorite depictions in the book, by the way, is of that little depiction of the puppet show, the puppets of Florian and Jonquil. I love that one. The art's really amazing. Let's move on to some sort of discussion of some of the people present in the story, besides Duncan and young Egg. So obviously, Dunk and Egg are important. Egg is quite fun. This kid this kind of scrappy kid who really just wants to.
He doesn't do a great job necessarily of playing a commoner. It
No.
slips through very quickly
Yes.
that he is used to a different sort of life. So
Yeah.
it's not like he's managing the role very well. It's he comes off as rather imperious at times.
Yes, he does, and kind of his insults to Dunk and his sort of his Dunk status is sort of. It was quite amusing, but it was really well done. Actually, one of my favorite artistic depictions isn't from Johnny's. It's Mike Miller's comic adaptation when Dunk finds Egg, wearing Arlen's armor, which is much too big for him, on top of his giant horse. It's a lovely image. But it works. It works. This kid, obviously, the idea is he's young enough that he's flexible. Like he hasn't absorbed this complete ideology of aristocrats versus commoners. It's
a bit of a fun adventure for him.
It's a fun adventure for him.
He really wanted to go to a tourney, and he kind of. So for him to, dress up as a peasant and hang out in the stable there and hop onto the war horse, and
it's all a bit
of fun for him, and
he doesn't fully grasp all the implications of what he's doing. He's a kid. He's going with the flow. It's one of the things I find that no one ever complains that Egg is too old seeming. Whereas people say, "Oh, Arya is too clever," such as except she uses very childish insults to people in like the first book. She is a child, and I think George's grasp of this I find it's pretty good. I think the thing is these people are in extraordinary circumstances. That leads them to maybe do extraordinary things, but I think things that children are capable of, especially if they're bright. Or if they are sufficiently traumatized in the case of Arya. I mean, the things she does. I recently saw the amazing Netflix original film, Beasts of No Nation, which is about child soldiers in Africa. And as a dramatized depiction of the kind of lives they lead and the things that these children, I mean, some of them are very young. We're talking 8, 9-year-old kids. It's horrifying. And yet it happens. It's happening now. Egg, of course, is not at all in that sort of traumatized state, thankfully. Despite the best efforts of Aerion to maybe terrorize him, as he suggested. When he had the story about Aerion. Is it this one?
Yeah.
Yes, where he tells him that he would suggest that, there's too many boys and maybe he should geld him and marry him.
Yeah.
Instead. Yeah.
That's a lovely thing to be saying.
Yeah, Aerion, my friend. And Aerion Bright Flame, of course, is a figure who has some interest for those who kind of speculate about A Song of Ice and Fire and the origins of certain characters, because Aerion's a fascinating figure who is fascinating from the stuff that George kind of hints at in The World of Ice and Fire, but his future role.
I don't think much of it made it in.
Some of it, but there's a little bit. Yeah. But he had a role to play in one of the Blackfire rebellions.
Yes,
and
we heard a few more things as we having that conference call. There were some things that George, were saying, "Oh, well, you can't share this and you can't share that," because these are clearly going to play into future Dunk and Egg novellas, but. I guess we can say that there seemed to be a little more complexity to the character than you get from this one story, where he's coming off as just mad and kind of your typical mad, monstrous Targaryen. Apparently, Harry Lloyd, who is reading the audiobook adaptation of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which was a pleasant surprise to us to hear, those who have heard it said he's very good. And that he pulls out his bit of his Viserys for Prince Aerion, which would seem appropriate because it seems like they do share some traits. But there might be more to this character. But he
Something about Byron was somebody that mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
Yeah,
that's very much Aerion.
Maybe a little more weight on the mad side.
Yeah. So he gets exiled to Lys.
Yes,
and that's where all the speculation comes from. Because George did admit in So Spake Martin, I think it was an email response to somebody, But there are probably, from that time that he's in this, some bastard offspring, and there might be descendants of him still around. And people look at Varus and they, Varus of Lys, and they think, could that be a connection? I don't actually think so. I think something else, but that said, I don't. It's an interesting line of thinking, anyways. It is seemed like a bit of a shot in the dark by Maekar to hope that a couple of years in the pleasure gardens of Lys would somehow straighten out Aerion.
Have him run wild for a while and then kind of hope that would settle him down. Being away from perhaps bad influences at court and things like that, sort of separating him from his usual crowd. And then, he's not the sort of prince in, his home capital. He's away in a foreign place. There'll be other people
I wonder why Lys of all places, of course.
Well, there are connections there and such, I guess.
Hi, Breezy.
Yes.
There are connections there. Well, the thing is Lys is not that far from Tyrosh, and Tyrosh has been a base of the Blackfires. Obviously, but George didn't have the idea of all this, of course. I just answered that myself. He wasn't thinking about the geopolitics
one of the places
of this.
that he had established, and
But in any case, Aerion is a character who obviously
I think we'll see him more in future Duncan.
I would expect we would definitely see him. And of course, he is the character who we later learn from. I think it's Mormont who first tells us.
Yes, I think
in the second book. This is the one. This is the one point where he kind of. I think he must have gone back just before finishing Clash of Kings, because Clash of Kings actually came out after the Hedge Knight, and there Mormont's telling John about Maester Aemon's history, and he mentions like the uncle who was the heir who died in a tourney mishap. Yep. So that was, I think he probably went back and kind of just worked it, like towards the end of writing it, decided to work in a little reference. And I think that's where he mentions Aerion. Yeah. One of them drank wildfire, thinking he turned into a dragon.
Yeah.
Which is obviously is a hint of what Aerys, the second, ends up maybe kind of thinking. But I thought that was pretty neat. But you just see the nascent little bits there that he kind of figured out almost kind of on the fly. Yeah. And later he fleshed it out further. Let's talk about, in a moment, when we see what Breeze wants.
Yes.
We're going to see about discussing the other two Targaryens are really significant here. Baelor and Maekar, because I think they are pretty significant, each in their own way. So Breeze just needed a bit of food and a little toy to play with or something, but
not easy living without Hellion.
No.
No.
Baelor,
one of the reasons our videos are late. I suppose we'll have to blame him.
Yes,
he does take a lot of. He's got a lot of energy, and we've had to spend a lot of time training him and such. But back to our Targaryens.
Yeah, Baelor Targaryen, the Baelor Breakspear, the Prince of Dragonstone, the heir to the Iron Throne, the greatest knight of his age, the heart of chivalry, I think or soul of chivalry, one or the other, what Arlen called him. Half Dornish, the son of Maria, Nimros Martell, and Daeron the Good. He is really sympathetic. He really comes off kind of a bit flawless, like he's kind of the perfect knight and perfect prince, from what we can see. But then that can be cloying, and maybe if George kept writing about him, it would have been cloying.
Yeah, but it's not here. He comes across as a, genuinely, good guy. He'll talk to Dunk about his claim, Arlen rode against you, and a tourney, broke 7 lances, and he acknowledges that he remembers Arlen, and which surprises I think Maekar, his brother. But it was 4 lances, not 7. The tale grew in the telling, but he's not. It's not like he's upset about that claim being made or anything.
He's honest.
He's an honest, sort of, kind of down to earth for a Targaryen prince, for the crown prince, and
he does come off as very sort of un-Targaryen from what he doesn't have.
And much too good for this world, for that world, clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. The good die young.
He would have been a very good king, and this is something that we see people lamenting in the following novels. And the great tragedy of the story is certainly that, Dunk's decision to go to the trial by 7 rather than accept, losing a hand and a foot or whatever it would have been for striking Aerion, leads to Baelor's death. Leads to his brother accidentally killing him with his mace.
Yeah.
And he passes out after it's all done and they think it's all, in the clear. And, he's got a traumatic head injury and it's just basically his helmet that's been...
It's a bit of horror there when they take it off. And Dunk thinks there's something red and dark kind of slides away or falls away from the head, and it's just terrible. Yeah. And then Dunk, the last thing, get up, just like he did to Thunder when he was in the Tourney, kind of trying. He's injured and he is trying to help him up, and it doesn't want him to be dead. It's
this has repercussions throughout the coming stories just the 2 stories that we've seen so far, because as Maekar tells Dunk, people start talking about him having done this on purpose, even though it's clear it's a mistake. But he plotted to become crown prince himself instead, and Maekar is a very different person from Baelor. He's like a Stannis Robert kind of relationship,
Dynamic.
Or maybe more of a Stannis kind of. And Baelor is sort of a cross between Renly and Robert with the good sides.
None of the excesses of Robert and none of or Renly, sort of just the good qualities.
Just the good qualities. Whereas Maekar is not a people person. He's kind of
Doesn't
grim.
he even grind his teeth at some point? Just like Stannis does. So he is
he doesn't get people to love him.
Yeah. People respect, maybe fear him, but they don't love him. No.
He's already being compared with his brother in a negative. He's a good fighter.
He's a good fighter? Not as good.
He's not a Baelor Breakspear.
No.
And then, so it has political ramifications, particularly in the 3rd novel, is where we're seeing the political side of it most clearly. But, Egg starts having to hear, even in the 2nd one, people start talking about how Maekar killed his brother, and obviously he's not happy to hear that about his father.
Yes.
So,
I don't know if we'll talk more about it in the 2nd one. But it's an interesting dynamic, and obviously, as we know, Maekar will go on to eventually be king, so succeeding not just this brother, but other brothers as well, who were in line, because Aerys becomes king after Daeron passes away and after Baelor's sons pass away. And then he passes away without issue. The mad brother Rhaegal has predeceased him apparently. So has Rhaegal's son, who was would have been heir.
He has a Lockwood daughter, right? Or no? Or is it Daeron?
No,
has
Rhaegal's sons has the I think they're twins. The World Lights of Fire has a little bit about them. I think. I hope. I think so.
In the family tree, at least.
In the family tree, anyways. And they could have been... So anyway, Maekar is kind of an unlikely successor.
Yes.
And then when Egg, the youngest of the sons, it's even unlikely.
Yeah, so the idea that Maekar killed his brother to ascend to the throne is, is ridiculous on the face of it, in the sense that he's way down the line. But it's clear that the Baelor Maekar dynamic was more known to people, and they were the more prominent, known brothers.
Yes.
Aerys was clearly less, their uncle Aerys was less of a...
Not interested in the court life.
It was the 2 the 2 elder princes that were the ones that people knew about. They were the ones that were out at tournaments and that they would see sort of taking a more active hand in things. So it was about Baelor and Maekar for people. Yeah,
that makes sense. Certainly the 2nd story expands on that a bit when it reveals sort of the Blackfire Rebellion, and that they each commanded, parts of the royal host and so on. Any other bits you want to discuss? A little bit of trivia.
Yeah.
Raymond Fossaway, when he is knighted, he decides to repaint his shield with the green apple.
Doesn't want to carry the same arms as his faithless cousin, so he makes it he's not ripe yet though, so he makes it a green apple instead of a red.
Presumably this is the birth of, he will found the green apple Fossaway branch. You see it mentioned in, I think the first time was in Clash of Kings, certainly by Storm of Swords. The red apple and the green apple.
So that must have also been inserted. He probably went back. Yeah, he said if he didn't.
Well,
have
you
that,
know
or...
what? No, It's an interesting thing.
Oh, did that come before and he decided
His
to...
Fossilway arms to us may have included the red and green apple already, but he then decided, well...
That's true.
Because it just probably popped into his head, it's a nice image of you have branches of family.
Yeah.
But then he said, there you go.
So we may see that in a future Dunk and Egg story, what exactly happens, because I think that it's likely that Dunk will meet up with a lot of his friends and acquaintances from these early stories later
Probably,
on.
very probable. And gosh, if I did not have one other bit of trivia that I wanted to comment on, but I've forgotten entirely, so I'll leave.
We'll have to save that for perhaps when we do the final piece, summing up things and...
Maybe, and just looking more at where the Dunk and Egg novellas will go, like what we know about George's ideas. In particular, Knight of the Seven Kingdoms provides some new hints that we did not have before about where these stories might go.
I think you mean The World of Ice and Fire.
No? I mean the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. The introduction that he wrote.
Oh, the introduction, of course.
Yes, had a little hints about other places that we didn't expect.
That's right. He mentions the places and such where
So, until our next video, hopefully soon, please allowing.
Yes.